Şimdi sözü bu oturumdaki moderatörümüz Erdinç Yılmaz'a bırakıyorum.
Hello again and welcome to the session Cinema, Ethics and Politics. In this session we will have 4 presentations. Neil Kennedy, he will present the image in Leo Carax Holy Motors, and Timna Rauch, she will present a paper called Misguided Helpmeets, Moral Evaluation in Dexter, Breaking Bad and House of Cards. Chiara Quaranta, she will present a paper entitled Iconoclastic Gestures, Image Destruction and Ethical Imagination in the Cinema. And Francesco Sticchi, he will present a paper called The End of American Exceptionalism Through 2 Family Sagas, Film-Philosaphy in the Face of Neoliberal Collapse. We plan to start with Neil Kennedy, but unfortunately he's not here at the moment. So there is Timna Rauch at the line, so I want to ask Timna if she's ready to make it her speech or not. Timna, are you
sure,
there?
Sure, I'm ready as I'll ever be.
Hello.
Hello.
We can hear you very well, and I guess we can also see you. But if you can allow us just a minute to figure out the technical obstacles, we will start with you, okay? All right, Timna, please introduce yourself, and then let's start with your speech. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it to Ankara, but I'm coming to you from the Netherlands at this point, from my tiny office space that I have here. So it looks less uncozy and intellectual as I would want it to, but you know, you can't have it all. Today I'm going to share some thoughts and ideas on moral evaluation in Dexter, Breaking Bad, and House of Cards. But let me begin by shortly explaining the context of the paper that I'm working on and the ideas that I will present to you today. They are part of a larger project on morally ambiguous protagonists in serial drama. This year I started working on my PhD, wherein I investigate how Dexter, Breaking Bad, House of Cards, and probably a few other titles constitute a genre. And this genre is not merely a connected set of features, stylistically or narratively. The most important connection between these series, for me at least, is that they represent a certain moral outlook. They share similar moral constructs and narrative patterns that either underline or comment on moral values of our days and age. And this idea of genre as a moral outlook is, maybe I should say in this Cine-Philosaphy environment, obviously borrowed from Stanley Cavell, who in his later work investigates classical Hollywood cinema in relation to moral philosophy and connects certain films as genres, the melodrama of The Unknown Woman and the comedies of remarriage. And Cavell claims that he assesses, quote, Cavell claims that the films he assesses, quote, recount interacting versions of a story or a myth. And to me, these stories of these 3 men do the same. These series share a certain narrative and stylistic features, but their interacting elements of these stories evolve around a moral plane. And one of these interacting elements that I want to focus on today is the idea of a misguided or perhaps rather imaginary helpmeet. This term, again, is borrowed from Cavell, who in turn takes it from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And in his work on film, genre, and morality and how these 3 to him are intertwined, Cavell offers an alternative to the dominant utilitarian and teleological views in ethical philosophy, wherein he says it's rather about questioning our moral lives instead of the deed or the motivation that comes before the actions. As he explains, quote, moral life is not constituted solely by the consideration of isolated judgments of striking moral and political problems, but is a life whose texture is a weave of cares and commitments in which one is bound to become lost and to need the friendly and credible words of others in order to find one's way, in which we at any time a choice may present itself, in pondering which you will have to decide whose view of you is most valuable to you, end quote. And these friendly and credible words of others are this other that you might need is referred to Cavell as the friend or as the helpmeet. But what if you're unable to make those connections? What if you choose to give value to the wrong friendships? And this is a question that he investigates in classical Hollywood drama. And according to Cavell, the women in these films are unknown in a sense, meaning that within their marriage or in their relationships, they seem unable to make themselves intelligible to their marital partners. This is not because the women in these films are incapable of making such connections. It's rather, as to put it in Catherine Wheatley's words, that these women long for equality, mutual education, playfulness, transfiguration. And these heroines in these films, they try to find that in their marriage, but the male characters in those melodramas do not rise to that challenge. And for Cavell, the women in those films show a story of transformation and have to find their own voices instead of the voice within the other. And something similar seems to be going on with the three stories that I want to talk about with you today. These men all struggle to connect to the people around them, or as Cavell would put it, they struggle to make themselves intelligible to others. Dexter grew up believing he's a psychopath, incapable of human emotions and connections. Walter White, the protagonist in Breaking Bad, is dismissed by nearly everyone he encounters in his life. And Frank Underwood in House of Cards is isolate himself in some kind of ivory tower. And in addition to, or perhaps rather because of, this lack of connection, this inability of these men to find their friends, these three men are also unable to find a moral voice of their own. They rather create imaginary personas outside of themselves, imaginary friends, if you will, that take over the function of that helpmeet that Cavell stresses is so important to moral life. But instead of helping them to find their own voice, these helpmeets appear to move these men further away from moral life. First, let us look at Dexter. He abides what he explains as the code of Harry. And Harry is Dexter's deceased father, and he's the one who found that Dexter already at a young age developed psychopathic tendencies. He had a fascination for the macabre. The young Dexter was enabled to form emotional connections and had a strong desire to kill and experiment with living things, I suppose. And because Harry believed that these dark impulses could not easily be unlearned, he decides to teach Dexter an extensive code, on the one hand to help Dexter function as a social being, and on the other to make sure that his kills are morally defendable. And throughout the series then, Dexter, in this narrative world, becomes a fully functional psychopath who fakes emotional relationship and decides to only kill those that murder themselves. And what happens is that Dexter evokes his thoughts on morality and his struggles with that code that is put upon him by Harry as via internalized voiceover. And in later seasons, even literally imagines Harry standing next to him, telling him what he ought to do. And thus, Harry in this series becomes an imagined helpmeet, a friend to Dexter, an other whose words Dexter needs in order to, as Cavell would put it, find his way. Walter White in Breaking Bad, who is the story of a chemistry teacher who literally breaks bad by involving himself in the world of drug dealers, he is rather creating a persona within himself. In the beginning, Walter keeps repeating to himself that what he does, the reason that he deals drugs, the reason that he engaged with criminal activity, is for his family. Because of his lung cancer and because his imminent demise, according to the doctors, he figures that via this illegal enterprise he might make his family some money to leave behind. And that's his motivation, almost as a Kantinian argument. But when he can no longer hide behind that argument and the world around him grows more violent and violent, Walter creates an alter ego, Heisenberg. And this persona becomes not only a pseudonym for Walter's criminal contacts, but it becomes a second personality that's able to stretch morality far further than Walter, the chemistry teacher, would. Heisenberg is part of a different world, a criminal world, and thus he is bound by different rules than Walter, the chemistry teacher, would be. And in a way, like the transformation that the women in the melodramas of Cavell go through, Walter too finds his own voice, or part of his own voice, and a voice that becomes louder and louder as the series progresses. And where Dexter has these internal monologues to evaluate his choices, and Walter in his own way too looks for ways to defend his action, Frank Underwood, the third character that I would like to discuss, almost moves beyond such moral questioning. He is cold and calculating. He will do anything to feed his hunger for power. And at first sight, he might seem to ask no moral questions at all when making decisions about who to throw under the bus or under the subway train, for that matter. And when we take a closer look at the most striking feature of this series, a self-constructed helpmeet is, however, revealed, namely the viewer. It's us. Frank continuously breaks the fourth wall in this series and thereby invites the viewer into his narrative world by explaining the rules in politics and his schemings. And again, if we look a little deeper at these three characters and we compare them to the women in the work of Cavell, where the women in the work of Cavell are trying to find their own voice or trying to transform within themselves, these three men actually turn to the voices of someone else. It's still someone outside themselves. It's not a transformation in the ugly duckling sense, ugly duckling to swan sense that Cavell assesses with these women in melodrama, but rather they stick to this outside party. And again, this is made most explicit in Dexter, where he, especially in the first season already, is actually going through some kind of identity crisis. Who is he? Whose voice is his and whose voice is not his? To take a short snip from a monologue from the first season, Dexter says, quote, "Harry was the only one who saw me, really saw me, so he taught me how to hide. That's what kept me safe. But sometimes I'm not sure where the vision of Harry ends and the real me starts. I'm just a collection of learned behavior, bits and pieces of Harry," end quote. So whose voice is Dexter really listening to? His own? A voice from the past? And also Walter struggles with this created helpmeet. And that's also made explicit in the early beginnings of the series, in the first season. When he first identifies as Heisenberg, it's immediately clear that Walter does not control this Heisenberg persona in the way that he might like to. In the introductory scene of the fifth or sixth episode of the season, Walter tells his partner in crime, Jesse, that he wants to stay away from the violence of the drug trade. However, that opening monologue and where he explains that he doesn't want the bloodshed and he doesn't want the violence, it's cross-cut with snippets from a scene that will later in the episode fully unfold. And it's a scene wherein Walter firstly identifies himself as Heisenberg, and it's a scene wherein he blows up his office, the office of a drug dealer. It is a violent scene. It's a scene with bloodshed. It's a scene of all those things that Walter in the beginning of the episode tells us he wants nothing to do with. So here already the lines between Walter and Heisenberg are immediately blurred. And that line will blur more and more as the story of Walter unfolds over the 5 seasons that Breaking Bad lasts. And Frank Underwood takes this whole idea of this whole complexity of this self-created helpmeet perhaps even a part further. Because, as I said, he isn't clearly conveying his moral evaluations, or not as clearly as Dexter and Walter might be. But as Cavell explains, quote, "What I characterize as making oneself intelligible is an interpretation moral perfectionism gives to the idea of moral reasoning. the demand for providing reasons for one's conduct, for the justifications of oneself, end quote. And that's precisely what Frank Underwood does when he breaks the fourth wall. He provides us with reasons and perhaps justifications for his actions, reasons and justifications why the world that he lives in works the way it does. And in doing so, the viewer in House of Cards is not merely forced in the role of helpmeet, but we are also made accomplices, in a way, of Frank's immoral actions. Linguist Laura Goldell and Sandrine Sorline investigated the wording of Frank's addresses to the viewer, and they explain that because, quote, the recipient does not have the prerogative of the addressee, Francis' questions can only be rhetorical questions. And this rhetorical technique to the false address and question creates the means of some complicity within the viewer by systematically forcing their approval. Francis can even anticipate potential negative reactions on the part of the recipient, thereby deflating any strong critical judgment that could be passed on to him, end quote.
Timna,
sorry Frank, in a sense...
sorry for interrupting, but we
no
are
worries.
running out of time. So,
yeah, I'm almost coming to the conclusion. So,
thank you.
So Frank evades moral evaluation almost in its entirety because we as viewers, as helpmeets, are incapacitated to take part in the conversation. And in the end, that is what should be the key to a moral life for Cavell. Because it's about dialogue, it's about the need of conversation and re-evaluation. However, in these three cases, there's only a monologue that teaches these men above will, that draws them from instead of towards a moral life. And in doing so, these series seem to confront their viewers with the most important question that we can ask ourselves. Whose voice do we listen to?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being so timely, Timna, Rauch. That was an interesting and it was a great speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Chiara, Quaranta, are you ready to speak?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll share my screen.
All right, thank you. Chiara Quaranta will be doing her speech named Iconoclastic Gestures, Image Destruction, and Ethical Imagination in the Cinema. I will give the word to Chiara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you all see the slides? Yes, okay. Hello everyone. So my talk today is going to focus on the ethics and aesthetics of iconoclasm in the cinema. And specifically, I will try to delineate how destructive gestures within an artwork can actually carry ethical concerns regarding visibility. I will provide some examples from avant-garde experimental and narrative films. But before delving into iconoclasm, I would like to focus a little bit on the visual field and the importance of the visual field for our engagement with the world. So recent years have seen an increase in scholarship on cinema and ethics to the point that we can say that ethics is now the core topic, or at least one of the core topics of film philosophy. And I think it attests more in general to the growing interest in the close but conflicting relationship between ethics and optics. And my specific research on the topic has focused, at least so far, on a European context within which our understanding of the visual field and of the status of the image hinges, among other things, on biblical and theological accounts. And so I would like to start this paper with a well-known biblical image, the aftermath of Adam and Eve's eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. And knowledge opens their eyes and makes their gaze reflective. And for the first time, they can see and notice their nudeness and feel shame, which is something that hopefully you'll be able to see in the image from the fresco, in which we have Adam hiding his gaze in shame, and equally in shame, Eve is trying to cover her body parts. And I think this image gives us an idea of how the visual field and the act of looking are not neutral occurrences, but are ethically charged and has to do with our ways of relating with others. But if we conceive the visual field as ethically implicated, then also producers and consumers of images are ethically implicated. Because what we share in and partake in the visual field, which we share with others and in which we build relationships, also provides ethical perspectives and involves ethical judgment. And images are a fundamental part of the visual field and are therefore relevant for our ethical, emotional, and political engagement with the world. However, notwithstanding the importance that images and images of art specifically have in our everyday relationship with others and our environment, the image, at least in a Western context, is still caught between truth and falsehood. And this ambiguity of the status of the Western image hinges on the variety of conflicting stances that have influenced its development, and among which we can list the Platonic skepticism, Plotinus's partial evaluation of images of art, the biblical prohibition, and the Christian controversies over the representation of God in a material frame. And following this variety of influences, the image, still in contemporaneity, is caught between a paradoxical state, because on the one hand, it is imbued with the ability to reproduce something about reality and our experience thereof, but also it is conceived as insufficient for the representation of the world and of our complex relationship with the world. And this dichotomy, I think, involves more strongly images of art, because if we think about, for instance, scientific images like X-rays, they're usually conceived as in a stronger relationship of likeness with their referent, with the phenomenal reality that has produced them in the first place, and so as trustworthy representation. Whereas images of art rarely enjoy such a privilege, and often we relegate them to the inferior level of knowledge, the Platonic eikasia, which is the indirect grasp of sensible things through their images. However, we do use images in our everydayness to establish a relationship with the world, to actually experience the world. And I think it is by looking at destructive gestures against images that this becomes particularly clear, that the ethical, emotional, and political charge of images surfaces. So for instance, if we look at historical iconoclasm, the destruction of images, there was the smashing of sacred icons in the 8th and 9th centuries, but also up to recent years, we have decolonization and BLM movements, efforts to remove statues of supporters of slavery. And this also physical engagement with images of art, the fact that we destroy them as well, not just that we produce them, attest, I think, to the ethical and emotional charge of images of art. And therefore, I think that iconoclasm can be an extremely interesting and challenging perspective in the cinema to understand our relationship with film images and more broadly with the visual field. Iconoclasm, more in general, hinges on the distance between a model, a referent, and the image. And accordingly, the image is conceived as in some ways insufficient for the representation of the model. And that is why we have destructive gestures against specific images in order to preserve the unrepresentability of certain models. Because one has to bear in mind that iconoclasm, historically, religiously, but also in an artistic context, does not advocate for the destruction of every image, but only those images which are deemed in a relationship of alterity with their model. So, for instance, religious iconoclasm produce a destruction, a defacement of statues or icons representing saints, Jesus, the Holy Mary, to preserve the unrepresentability of the sacred. And what I think we can find in cinema when we start looking at destructive gestures within films is that cinematic iconoclasm, what I term cinematic iconoclasm, can also provide us with an ethical perspective and actually encourage the spectator's ethical imagination. And by iconoclasm in cinema, it means the either literal or metaphorical destruction of images within an artwork. So if we talk about an iconoclastic aesthetics in films, we are looking at both literal aggressions against the film strip, but also metaphorical destruction of an aesthetics of mimesis. And in this aesthetic, there is a privileging of the oral dimension to the depreciation of the visual image in an overall rejection of mimesis. And the oral dimension is privileged in two quite conflicting ways. It can develop as intelligible voices in order to counterbalance the falsehood proper to the visual image, or it can, at the opposite, develop as language failure to actually account for our experience of reality, and therefore it parallels orally the destruction of figuration. And my argument is that such destructive gestures within films encourage the spectators to sustain an ethically charged imaginative effort, because we are faced with an aesthetics that troubles our more traditional modes of consuming what is visible and audible, and therefore challenges our ways of engaging with the visual world, promoting a liminal ethics. It's a liminal ethics because we still have an image, so it sinks its roots in visibility, in what is orally or visually accessible for us on the screen, but it always evokes the unrepresentable model through a destructive aesthetics. So there is a tension in iconoclastic films that require an active effort from the viewer that deals with the ethical imagination. So hopefully some of these ideas will become clearer with the examples I have. I have perhaps a bit too many examples, so I apologize in advance for going through them quite quickly. And the first set of examples are from avant-garde and experimental film, and focus specifically on the letterist avant-garde, the situationist avant-garde, and Carmelo Bene's experimental films. And the directors associated with this avant-garde all advocated explicitly for the destruction of cinema in one way or another, and all shared a rejection of mimesis, of an aesthetic of mimesis, of cinema as reproducing the phenomenal referent. So what we have in their films is both a literal destruction of the physical support of cinema, the film strip, which among other things is soaked in water, burnt, under or overexposed to light, scratched. And I hope you can see from the stills I've added here. So for instance, in Isidore Isou's film, we have the defacement of the character to the scraping of the film strip. In Maurice Lemaitre, there's the soaking of the film strip and overexposure to light. And then in Carmelo Bene's film, in this instance, the film strip has been burnt. So there is a physical aggression that is reminiscent of religious iconoclasm, the literal attacking of images of art. But there is also a metaphorical destruction of a mimetic reproduction in these films that can develop in a variety of ways, stylistic techniques. So we can have a separation, for instance, between the image track and the soundtrack, which are treated as completely independent from each other, or in the words of Isidore Isou, the founder of Lettrism, as indifferent to each other. So the soundtrack articulates a story that doesn't find a parallel in the image track. But destructive gestures, again, mimetic reproduction in cinema, can also develop as an undermining of logocentric speech in favor of logosless voices and bodily noises, through the exploitation of blank screens, which drag time and also can provide the audience with an unpleasant cinematic experience, such as it occurs in Guy Debord's 24 minutes black screen that concludes its film All's for Sad. Or at the opposite, we can have a destruction of mimesis, of a mimetic access to the representation through an overabundance of visual and oral elements, which, however, are blurred and opaque. And in this way, we have a further distancing of the film image from phenomenal reality, as it occurs, for instance, in the film of Carmelo Bene. And in all these cases, we have a metaphorical assault on the spectator, which is done through the nonsensical narratives or the absence of narrative and such disruptive aesthetics, which both provide us with the possibility of an unpleasant cinematic experience, but definitely hinders processes of identification and comprehension. But these disruptive aesthetics can also promote the spectator's imagination. And in fact, viewers of these films are encouraged to bring something very personal to their film viewing. their own imagination, their ability to imagine what's not shown to us on screen, or to imaginatively and reflectively assign meaning. So to fill the gaps, the oral, visual gaps, but also the gaps of meaning that are opened in this distancing of image and reality. And therefore, electrism, situationism, Carmelo Bene's films all invoke a thoughtful, imaginative spectatorship through the distraction of our more habitual ways of consuming what is visible and audible. I have other examples that hopefully will clarify even further the relationship between these imaginative possibilities opened for the viewer by distractive aesthetics and the realm of ethics. And these examples are from Derek Jarman's Blue and Ingmar Bergman's Cries and Whispers. And these films relate to ethics in a way in a stronger manner because their topic, their subject matter are ethically charged. They deal with suffering and death, which are already ethical issues. And both films foreclose mimetic representation and figuration. So we do not have figurative images of suffering and death in these films. But actually, either through utter no-representational aesthetics or no-representational instances in the films, they both appeal to the spectator's ethical and empathic imagination. So we are encouraged by the film, we don't have to, but we are encouraged by the films to actually sustain an empathic effort with the pain and suffering that we feel is surfacing on the screen. And the type of empathy that these films are trying to arise in the audience is an unsettling empathy, because what we are required to feel, to experience, is actually to imaginatively share the pain of the other. And in order to do so, we have to find that place of sorrow within ourselves. So we have to enter in a resonance with the pain we ourselves may have experienced. However, the pain of the other can never be reduced to our pain. And that is why we can talk about empathic unsettlement produced by these films. So for instance, Derek Jarman's Blue is a film about the director's own experience with living with AIDS, and it deals with suffering, physical pain, and death. And the film is constructed through a no-representational image track, an ultramarine blue screen, and a soundtrack which alternates the clarity of hearable sounds to those irreducible to meaning. And in so doing, the film is presenting us with the idea of listening as being with, as a sharing of a painful experience, which, however, always remains other than our experience. We cannot reduce it to a consumable image. And therefore, it asks us, by foreclosing a mimetic representation of the body in pain, for instance, an opening to the other, an opening to listen to the other. And what we find, if we enter in a resonance with this film, we are encouraged to empathically, but unsettling also, encounter the topics, the themes of the film, AIDS, suffering, and death. And another film that does something similar in terms of aesthetics and ethics is Bergman's Cries and Whispers, which, however, is slightly different from the other film examples that are more experimental and non-narrative, because Cries and Whispers is a narrative film, overall figurative film, which at times it is interrupted by no-representational images, which are accompanied by pre-semantic or non-semantic sounds, that of cries and whispers. And in fact, hopefully you can see from the stills I've included, at certain instances in the film, we have these non-representational images, the fades to red and the red monochromatic screens, which destroy the figurative image of the actress's special close-up. So in front of our eyes, something familiar, the face of a human being, is destroyed gradually, and then we are presented with a non-representational image, this intensely red screen. And I argue that this non-representational choice, this iconoclastic aesthetics of the shots, attests to the image and language failure to account for a person's inner suffering and interiority. Because what we actually experience in the surfacing of the red, of the screen becoming red, is actually the surfacing of a violently suffering interiority. But the fact that we are not given access to this interiority, to this trouble, to this pain, through mimetic images, but actually instead through a non-representational image, also attests to the fact that we can never render someone else's life and inner suffering a consumable image, a mimetic image, an easily accessed image. To conclude, what I've tried to demonstrate is that iconoclasm in the cinema can be an aesthetic and ethical approach to audiovisual images, and through the distraction of more habitual forms of presenting us audiovisual images, it can nurture the spectator's ethical imagination, because we are the man to make sense of what we not see on the screen or what we not hear on the screen. And I think more broadly, this challenging of our rights to actually show something on a screen encourages a broader taking of responsibility for the images we decide to produce, to look at and share. Because again, cinema, film images are part of the visual field, are part of the ways in which we establish relationship and we provide our own perspective to others. So I think that an iconoclastic aesthetics, specifically in regard to ethically charged models, can promote the creation of a community of gazes in which we share the invisibility of a sense, in the words of Marie-José Mozen, instead of a commerce of the gazes that certain mimetic images can actually produce. This is the end of my papers. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. That was a great speech. It was unique even. And we will go on with Francesco Sticchi if you are ready, Francesco.
Yes.
Or,
let me just...
Francesco
can you all see?
Yeah. Francesco will be presenting a paper called The End of American Exceptionalism Through Two Family Sagas, Film-Philosaphy in the Face of Neoliberal Collapse. I will leave the word to you. Thank you, Francesco.
Thanks, thank you very much, and thanks also for allowing me to participate online. I'm sorry that I cannot be there, but I'll try to do my best with this online presentation. So, yes, what I will cover is the failure, let's say, of neoliberalism in connection to family values, and with these two TV series, with Ozark and Breaking Bad, also outlining a sort of progression between the two series. I will describe very quickly my film philosophical approach in connection with a certain identification of neoliberalism, and in particular to family values and their role in the neoliberal ecology, and talk about how we go from exceptional individual narrative in Breaking Bad in the face of crisis to a sort of collapse of the neoliberal dream with Ozark. So just to go very quickly to the general approach, I use a Deleuzian approach to film philosophy, so identifying film and media as materialist blocks of sensation that generate ideas through affective structures, so blocks of sensation that produce and interact with viewers. This also means, of course, in a certain sense, that for Deleuze and for this certain account of film philosophy, every experience, every artistic experience is also an encounter. It's a possibility for transformation, for becoming, and also possibly politically for counter-subjectivation, because by encountering a world with its own ideas, with its own ethical values, and so on and so forth, of course, we also interact with the possibility of different ideas, different worlds, and transformation of ourselves. So, in a very experimental way, taking the Spinozist motto, we do not know what a body can do, we do not know what a viewer can do in relation to film and media. And of course, I go more to the political direction with these two TV series, understanding also the ways in which they relate to a general political ecology. And just to quote Mark Fisher on how Breaking Bad is evidently political, Mark Fisher very funnily said that imagine the story of Breaking Bad being set in any country with the National Health Service. There will be no story, no need for Walter White to do what he does. And so automatically we get that from this very instant. So my approach is also enriched by the contribution of ideas that I take from Mikhail Bakhtin, the idea of chronotopes and dialogism, where Bakhtin, very similarly to Deleuze, thinks about artistic experience as a block of sensation, as a medium that puts together time and space, that creates words with their own subjectivity, with their own structure, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the chronotope is never a fixed structure, but is always in movement, is always multiple in itself, is always polyphonical, and of course it's dialogical, because not only it's multiple in itself, but it's multiple also in relation to the reader, to the viewer, that continuously experiment through the interaction with a particular chronotope. And what is also interesting, according to Bakhtin, is that every chronotope has a relation to its own history, in the sense that artistic chronotopes exist and have a meaning because they relate to a general ecology. And in fact, this is what we are going to investigate, what is the neoliberal ecology. And according to the sources and the literature that I draw upon to investigate neoliberalism, essentially with neoliberalism we can identify a particular transformation of capitalism, one that moves in two ways, by combining movement of deterritorialization and movements of reterritorialization. So on one side, neoliberalism is affected and characterized by the complete deterritorialization of financial flows. So the market, the primary role of the market, the liberation, let's say, of the finance, and the role of finance of the debt economy, and so on and so forth, characterize this endless movement of money that redefines wages, that is also associated with precarization and with also with the debt economy and the human capital as a key concept. But on the other hand, this enormous continuous movement is associated with the reterritorialization, with the need to have a very strict structure of stability, of control, even of despotic control, in order to organize, let's say, these financial flows. And so this is why, for instance, for many authors like Sandro Mezzadra, Roberto Ciccarelli, or Veronica Gago and Melinda Cooper, there is a combination between enormous economic freedom and despotic rule, and also the exploitation of the care economy, of the affective economy, of the very modes through which we as human beings collaborate and cooperate. And it's not incidental, actually, according to Melinda Cooper, that actually neoliberalism has been associated with a reassessment of family values, in particular in the North American context, with the cult of responsibility connected with the human capital, with the idea that we as individuals, we are responsible for our economic actions, and so we are the ones that take on debts, credits, but also guilts and shame. And so this reterritorialization takes place also with the obsession for ownership, debt as a key driver of the economy, and the housing market, of course, and the crisis connected with that is a key in that sense, and also family as the mainstay of production and reproduction. And it's not incidental, in fact, that in the 80s in US context, but not only, we have an explosion of family narratives, both in cinema and television. And in fact, it's not incidental also that with the crisis of neoliberalism, we see also crisis of the families being investigated, not only in the literature, in philosophy, in sociology, but by cinema itself. Let's think about Parasite. Parasite, after all, is a film about precarity that is set about the conflict of classes, but also the conflict of two households around the structure of the family and its economic function. So, moving to our case study, as Timna was described extremely well, so we have Walter White as this frustrated chemistry teacher that arrives at a breaking point also in connection with the fact that he feels that he's not recognized for his own quality, because he's supposed to be a genius, he's supposed to be considered a great scientist. Also, he has lost an opportunity to participate in the high-tech economy, and finds itself at an economic collapse, but also in a state of social collapse, in the sense that together with financial collapse, there comes also an anxiety about his own authority as father figure. And again, as Timna was saying, it's not incidental that one of the refrain that Walter White repeats in his association with the drug mart, and he's becoming Heisenberg and becoming this drug lord, is that he's doing that for the family, to reclaim his role as father, but also as the breadwinner, and so on and so forth. And it's also interesting how we can observe chronotopically the crisis of this particular family, of the White family, in the sense that being set in New Mexico, together with the anxiety about the role and the precarization, we have also anxiety about racial identity and the fact that the interaction with the Mexican drug cartel is also a dirtening, let's say, of the whiteness of Walter White, but also the only way that Walter White has to become an entrepreneur. And together with that, there are gender anxieties that are connected exactly with the fact that he, being at the beginning very much debated as a family figure, as a father figure, is in fact many times undermined by Skylar, his wife, who is a traditional carer in the classical sense of the word, but also the one more in charge. And so I have also clips, maybe we can watch it later if we have some time. So it's interesting in the conflict between these two figures also how the process of breaking bad for Walter White is a way through which actually he reclaims this lost role. He reclaims to be the father, the breadwinner, and also to be in charge of his economic power. And in fact, everything he does is very much motivated by this very North American Protestant work ethics, the idea that you have to earn your own money, that he has to demonstrate his individual qualities. And as a matter of fact, also from the fact that being so much in control, he also becomes a sort of manipulator, of psychological manipulator towards all the others. And it's also interesting that, notwithstanding the fact that we can morally evaluate negatively, Walter White, he still remains a sort of fallen hero, a tragic hero, because of his particular qualities, his genius, but also because of great moments in the show that every fan of the series knows word by word, that give a stature to Walter White. You know, also says lines like "say my name," as to reclaim this sort of great identity status. So, failure of the family, neoliberal collapse and crisis of the family, but still a tragic importance. When we move to Ozark, we have exactly the same story, in the sense that we have the birth family, a typical American family, which, in order to aim for the dream of social mobility, gets in touch with the Mexican drug cartel. And they move from Chicago to the Ozark, the set of the story, so near, let's say, the Trump area, more or less, in order to reinvest particular money. And we also see the same ideas reassessed. For instance, by Martin Bird, the father figure, here that in the opening monologue says, money is a measure of a person's choices. So there's no society, very much like in the famous Margaret Thatcher motto, and there is no alternative, but the only thing that you can do to demonstrate that you exist in the world is basically, you know, work hard and demonstrate that you earn your own money. So similar morality, similar structures, and also this interesting contiguity between the border that we can see, of course, in interaction between, let's say, the classical American family and Mexican drug cartel. And what is interesting as well is that we also see very much the series pervaded by gender tension, by the fact that actually in this particular case it is the wife that actually takes charge of the family and is more similar to Walter White in her being not just the breadwinner but the leader of the family, being the manipulator, also being very practical in the decision that the family needs to take on together, while Marty is presented more as a cold accountant and incapable of having a clear and strong emotional life. So there are also these transformations that define, of course, a transformation in capitalism as we move on to our days. In fact, one may be even tempted to say that Wendy is a post-feminist heroine to some extent. However, what is really interesting about Ozark is that while in Breaking Bad we could see a sort of tragic dimension, also motivated by the fact that the series very much has the tone of Western and epic and crime and classical crime stories, Ozark has a very gloomy and melancholic tone, up to the point that we may be tempted to say, as the creators of the series actually argued, that they didn't want to do an exciting saga, but they wanted to do something that was more similar to slow cinema in many ways. So there is no tragic heroism, and actually all the characters of the Birds family are not really interesting in many particular ways. They are actually very we find very difficult to find any connection of empathy with them. And what we see instead is this very gloomy atmosphere in which every relation is regulated by the sort of Malthusian, Darwinian social selection. And actually, the very possibility for the Birds family to succeed is by destroying other households and destroying the livelihood, in particular in the Ozark, with even the most depressing effect that the two sons, Charlotte and Jonah, end up becoming simple replicas of their own parents. So there is even a sense of fatalism together with that. And just as a final note on this particular series, exactly to mark the difference between Breaking Bad and Ozark, we can find that in particular with the only tragic character in the series, that is Ruth Langmore, that belongs to a sort of quote-unquote redneck white trash family that never moves out from their social status, but she is the most brilliant character. She's smart, she's very strong, she's also very empathetic, and there's a code of honor that makes her very likable. In fact, is one of the most beloved characters of the series. But notwithstanding that, notwithstanding the fact that she manages to get out with her competence and courage from her start living condition, at the end of the day, she's sacrificed in the final episode of the series as a sort of curse that she takes on herself. And actually, the creator of the series said the Langmore curse that puts this working class family in the dirt, essentially, is the capitalist curse, is the fact that actually that very dream of social mobility is a false dream. And it's actually one that nobody believes in anymore. So, in a certain sense, Ozark signs the end, the collapse of the very dream of social mobility. And so, let's just arrive to this conclusion. What I've tried to investigate here is that it is possible to put together a film philosophical approach that understands images not just as producer of thought, but also as part of an infrastructure and an ecology, as part of a neoliberal ecology. But at the same time, these images that allow us to connect to general social dynamics allow us also to critically investigate it and counteract it. In fact, the fact that both Ozark and Breaking Bad present a sense of failure, and Ozark in particular a lack of any idea of progress, should not be seen as a sort of pessimistic or miserabilistic view of the world, but instead, talking again about Mark Fisher, they stress the need to invent new form of life, to invent a new world ahead. And so, let me conclude just with this remark on Mark Fisher. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco, for making such a nice and unique speech. We will continue with Neil Kennedy. He will present a paper called The Image in Leo Carax's Holy Mothers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Hello, thank you. Hope you can all hear me. Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation. I really do sincerely apologize for my late arrival. It turns out that Google Maps and the Turkish alphabet don't always mix, at least not for me, but I'm delighted to be able to speak to you today about Holy Motors. I don't know if my PowerPoint can be loaded, if that's possible. So, Holy Motors is a work of cinema which defies classification. It is a deeply self-reflective film which meditates on cinema itself as an art form, elegizes its history, and expresses the anxiety of the cinephile, such as director Leos Carax, confronted with the slow death of the traditional shared cinematic experience, the experience of watching a film together with others in a cinema. In this new world, mediated more than ever by the video image in its profusion all around us, especially on the many platforms offered by social media and the internet, Carax asks us what cinema can still be or what it is becoming, and goes so far as to imagine whether there can still be a cinema if the audience has gone missing. So in this respect, the film takes up very profoundly the first challenge posited by Robert Sinnerbrink in this morning's keynote lecture of the philosophical implications of the huge ontological shift taking place in the contemporary production of what we still call film, that is, the move from analog to digital image creation. Yet, unlike the majority of films, including digital films, this film is neither narrative nor discursive. Holy Motors is a film purely about the image, particularly, and in particular, the image as spectacle. This is a film about the production of images, images which appeal to us, the audience, to the extent to which an audience for these images still exists, but they appeal to us on a visceral and affective level. The status of the image in this film, therefore, is the problem that I want to consider. So the film consists of a series of episodes. I'll briefly describe the action for you if you've not seen it. I strongly recommend it. It's one of my favorites. It consists of a series of episodes loosely tied together by a simple overarching narrative or framing story, without any real narrative, any real plot to speak of, or any developmental logic. So Monsieur Oscar, played by the amazingly versatile Denis Lavon, is a mysterious performer who is chauffeured around Paris by the Holy Motors limousine company. He spends his day going to different appointments, at each one of which he transforms into a new character and performs a kind of dramatic scene, though one which does not appear to be recorded and has, apparently, no audience. We see him meticulously prepare for each new job in the limousine, transforming himself through costume and makeup, sometimes radically and sometimes simply, and adopting very different physicalities for each role. And I've got some lovely screenshots for you. So in the first one, as we can see, Oscar transforms himself through makeup and costume and transforms his physicality into a pitiful old woman, a beggar begging on the streets of Paris and wishing already for death. Secondly, in a compelling sequence, Oscar uses motion capture technology to act out first a fight, then a love scene, transforming himself through digital image manipulation into a fantastical creature and exhausting himself to the point of collapse in the process. Then, thirdly, I'm skipping ahead here, but in a story which seems to intersect with the framing story, in which Monsieur Oscar begins his working day by bidding goodbye to his daughters, Lavon, either playing Monsieur Oscar or perhaps playing a character played by Monsieur Oscar, acts out the beginnings of a short family drama, as a father picking up his daughter from a party objects strongly to the lies about her evening that she tells him. Then, on another occasion, this is the second last one I'll mention, again blurring the boundaries between the appointment and the framing story, blurring the boundaries between performance, fiction, and reality, Lavon and Kylie Minogue play out what appears to be a doomed love affair. And Kylie Minogue also sings in a way which actually really works. So one way to view the operation of each of these appointments, or each of these constituent episodes in this film, is to see them as building towards the depiction of a key image, an image which often depicts, as in the examples I've shown, two figures, bodies or personalities, Oscar, played by Lavon, and another performer. So you can see some of these in my screenshots. Each of these episodes, as many of the critics have commented on, that Oscar performs in, seem to represent a different genre of cinema, from the musical, like this one, to the family drama, from science fiction to gothic horror, from eroticism to the crime thriller, and so on. Throughout it, Monsieur Oscar's activity appears to have no discernible purpose other than to create this series of spectacles for no apparent audience. And to repeat, throughout most of the film, it does not even appear that his activity is being recorded in any way. In a brief mid-film conversation in his limousine with a man who appears to be some kind of contractor or superior in the company, Oscar insists that he performs this work only for the beauty of the gesture, la beauté du geste. Indeed, in one of the appointments, as you can see here, in which he plays the horrifying Monsieur Merde, a kind of ghoulish creature paired with the model beauty of Eva Mendes, as you see here, Oscar even seems to frustrate all attempts to capture his image, abducting Mendes and absconding with her to the sewers, running away from the photographer who wants to photograph them together, and assaulting and biting off the fingers of his assistant. This episode is particularly instructive as to Carax's view of the image as having a value distinct from the merely beautiful or sublime, showing us that he has come a long way from his beginnings in the Cinéma du Look movement. And in this same episode, when Mendes is introduced to us, she is being photographed by an obsessively captivated photographer, as you can see here, who is hypnotically repeating the word beauty, only to switch his focus when Oscar's Monsieur Merde appears, to fixate on him, repeating the word weird over and over. So how do we interpret this amazing but very curious, very strange, very difficult to understand film? Existing critical literature on Holy Motors presents a range of very different perspectives on this film, each choosing to highlight a different aspect of it, which they consider to be the defining one. For Sage Walton, for example, this multi-layered film, composed of movement, materiality, and multiplicity, is best understood as part of a neo-Baroque media of the late 20th and 21st centuries. Walton argues that what she terms the rampant proliferation of the film justifies the neo-Baroque label. Drawing on the work of José Antonio Maraval and Gilles Deleuze, Walton argues that it is movement first and foremost, in her words, endless movement and propulsion rather than vision, which defined the historic Baroque age. And so, in arguing that this film exemplifies the neo-Baroque, she also argues that movement of man and machine is at the heart of this film. Quote, human and technological action is conceived of as a holy or sacred motor that keeps this film, and by extension all of cinema, running, even into states of exhaustion, end quote. It is therefore the kinetic and gestural expressiveness of Oscar, first and foremost, for her, rather than the visual transformations he undergoes, which give force and meaning to the spectacles he creates. For Jeremy Biles, however, the key to our understanding of Holy Motors lies in the film's dreamlike or oniric qualities. Drawing on the work of Sigmund Freud, Biles highlights the concept of unheimlich, or the uncanny, to explicate the film and what he sees as its ambivalent hesitation between the sacred and the dreamlike. Quote, Holy Motors enacts a kind of cinematic convergence of the logic of the sacred with the logic of dreams or the unconscious, defamiliarizing the everyday and eliciting ambivalent effects, fear and desire, longing and loathing, end quote. And then finally, for Ohad Landesman, Holy Motors is best understood as a reflexive meditation on cinema itself. Landesman situates the opportunities and anxieties generated for Carax and for the viewing cinephile by this transformation at the heart of the film, the shift between analog and digital film. As he writes, quote, Holy Motors becomes a meta-cinematic work about the death of cinema and its concurrent rebirth, showcasing cultural and critical anxieties about the impact of new technologies on cinema's development. For Landesman, the film hesitates between declaring the birth of a new digital era, a definitive rupture or revolution in film production, or simply a new and necessary evolutionary stage. The profusion of small and easily portable cameras and the development of non-indexical filmmaking, that is, the depiction of images which have no exact real-life counterpart, demonstrate a new relation between cinematic fiction and reality, creating profound philosophical and aesthetic problems. So all of these interpretations, in my view, have much to recommend them, and it is a testament to the creativity and complexity of this film that such different interpretations all have nonetheless a real discursive force. However, in beginning my own research towards my own interpretation of the film, I have turned to the work of the philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy in an attempt to better understand the role and nature of the image that we are seeing. So let us first of all note the central importance of the image, understood in the broad sense to encompass both the painted and cinematic image, but also images as found in other arts, such as literature, to Nancy's philosophy. Indeed, Nancy describes a shift which he locates between the Renaissance and the 19th century, between the painted and the projected or cinematic image, as the third decisive moment in the West. During this shift, I've got the quote there, European thought shifted from painting to the projection screen, from representation to presentation, and from the idea to the image, or more precisely, from the fantasy or phantasm to the imagination. While the art of antiquity, argues Nancy, focused on the representation of exemplary types and figures like Homer or Alexander, the depiction of which was slowly refined over time, the modern period witnesses a category change. Drawing on Immanuel Kant, Nancy suggests that today the image, quote, that is not representative, at least not in the current sense of the word, but presentative, appresentative, or apperceptive, that is perceiving for itself, constitutive or productive of its object or of itself as an object, and thus, in the end, a purveyor of knowledge, end quote. So a major shift in our understanding of what the image does. The image is marked by a withdrawal and a setting apart from the rest of the world, in Nancy's view. It is presented to us and distinguished from us by what Nancy terms a trait and also a retrait in French, or a withdrawal. It is both distinct and contains within itself a fond, or ground, which forms the underside of the image. Images which are set apart and cannot be touched, though with which we can form a relation, are for Nancy both frivolous and holy. For him, quote, the painted sky contains within itself what is sacred in the sky, insofar as it is the distinct and the separated par excellence, end quote. For Nancy too, images are characterized by a force and a presence which are what defines them. To quote, the traits and lines of the image are themselves something from its intimate force. For its intimate force is not represented by the image, but the image is it. The image activates it, draws it and withdraws it, extracts it by withholding it, and it is with this force that the image touches us, end quote. The image has a certain stability which sets it apart from the contingency and endless chaotic variation of existence, a formlessness and groundlessness which has perhaps, if we're to follow Landesman's line of thought, been exacerbated by the development of digital cinema, echoing perhaps Deleuze's discussion of the need for art to temper and modulate the relationship between form and existential chaos, and to provide a controlled balance between the two. Nancy too sees the image as something which has been extracted, as it were, from chaos and set apart from it. Drawing on Martin Heidegger, he argues, I think this is my final quote, that the image is constituted by and as the conjunction of the concept's unity and the pragmatic chaos of sensation. So the image, the chaos of sensation, tempered by the unity of the concept. In Holy Motors, the one or more frequently two characters who appear in each episode's crowning or emblematic image are set apart in some way from the rest of the film, either by framing or by location, or both. The old woman that we saw in the first screenshot stands out from the crowd by her height and her positioning. Monsieur Baird, as we saw in the final one, abducts Eva Mendes and carries her off with him to the sewers. The father and daughter are in close quarters in a car. Monsieur Oscar, and they're shot straight on and framed in a way that emphasizes their closeness to each other. Monsieur Oscar and Kylie Minogue have their scene in a hotel rooftop garden. So there is a degree, as we see, of separation, a degree of being closed off, being cut out, or being framed away. Each image, however, is also marked by a particular emotional intensity, whether it be pitiful tragedy, acquisitive lust, doomed love, paternal envy, murderous rage. The image, while making playful nods in the direction of cinema and its history, forms a means of transmitting this effect, first and foremost, to the viewing audience. But this does not fully, in my view, capture the power or the meaning of Carax's images, at least insofar as they can be understood by Nancy's philosophy. If the images were only about the representation of a scene, an emotion, a relationship, they could not be termed presentational rather than representational, but this is exactly Nancy's argument. As Nancy argues in relation to the history of painting, quote, a painting paints nothing, it is beyond representation and beyond the gaze itself, a being there of the beyond, an être là de l'au-delà, end quote. So to conclude, and the basis for my future investigations, my future researches on this topic and on this film, are that an image must therefore open itself up to a beyond, to something more than what is merely given to us in this world of existence. Holy Motors, with its curious referentiality, its lack of narrative form, its circular structure, its meditations on the future of art, and its visual and emotional intensity, is a film that perhaps begins to provide an illustration of what Nancy's words and his concepts can really mean to the makers and the viewers of cinema. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy, for this great speech. I would like to thank Timna, Rauch, Chiara, Quaranta, Francesco, Sticchi, and Niall Kennedy for all the effort and for all this contribution they have put into this. And thank you for being a part of this. We will skip to the Q&A session. If there are any questions from the audience, I will give a moment to them to ask. Sorularımız varsa alabiliriz. I guess there are no questions. Actually, this was the last speech of the day, and I think we are running out of time also. So thank you for contributing and being here, and have a good night.